Following the Battle of Horseshoe Bend and the Battle of New Orleans, Andrew Jackson becomes known as a daring leader all over this nation. But he is ready to give up his public life. He even writes a letter to President Monroe in which he says that he just wants to live out his days quietly on the Hermitage with his beloved Rachel. But then Jackson starts hearing news out of Washington that troubles him. He hears that lawmakers are now making laws that favor the wealthy. He finds out that lawmakers are doing things that benefit the important states of the Northeast while neglecting the newer states like Tennessee. So with encouragement from his supporters, Jackson decides to enter the presidential election of 1824. Now his opponents are going to be Henry Clay and John Quincy Adams. Jackson couldn't be any different from John Quincy Adams. Adams comes from a very important and wealthy family. His father, John Adams, had been the second president of the United States. He had a formal education from Harvard, which even then was a very prestigious university. And then you have Jackson, who grew up on the frontier, an orphan, who made his own way in the world. And even though he was a lawyer, he didn't have that formal education. Well, when the election is over, Andrew Jackson has won the popular vote. But in America, we don't elect our presidents by the popular vote. We use a system called the Electoral College. And when you vote, you're telling the members of the Electoral College, this is who we would like to see elected. But when the Electoral College gets to Washington, D.C. to make the decision, John Quincy Adams and Henry Clay have made a deal. Henry Clay tells John Quincy Adams, hey, I'll give you my Electoral College if, when you become president, you make me the new Secretary of State. Now, the Secretary of State was an important position. It was then, and it is now. That's the third most powerful person in the American government, only behind the president and the vice president. Well, when it's all said and done, their deal works. And John Quincy Adams wins the presidency over Andrew Jackson. That deal between Adams and Clay became known as the corrupt bargain. Well, it wasn't long after that corrupt bargain that Jackson and Adams are at the same party together, and Jackson strides right up to Clay, and everyone at the party holds their breath because, you know, Jackson, he's got that fiery temper, and he's a fighter, and he challenges people to duels, and they don't know what's going to happen. But all that Adams does is extend his hand for a handshake. Only he wasn't putting out a hand to say, hey, we're good. He extends his left hand, which was considered a big insult to Adams in front of everyone there. When Jackson gets back to the Hermitage, he almost immediately begins work on getting elected in 1828. He's going to try it again on this presidential deal. Well, his supporters are behind him. They get the help from some major newspapers. They even arrange a reunion tour of the Battle of New Orleans to remind people of the things that Jackson had done for this nation. Now, Rachel didn't want Andrew Jackson to run, but he did. And it turned out to be one of the dirtiest elections in presidential history. Jackson's supporters said terrible things about Adams' supporters. Adams' supporters said terrible things about Jackson and his supporters. The worst thing of all was that Rachel got dragged into this. The rumors started going around, and it was printed in newspapers that Rachel and Andrew Jackson weren't legally married because her divorce from her first husband in Kentucky wasn't finalized. There was a little bit of truth to that. Right after they had originally got married, years before they find out that the divorce wasn't legal, they hurry up and legalize it and remarry. But to be said that you were living with a man who you were not married to was one of the worst insults, if not the worst, that could be given to a woman in 1828. And it makes Rachel sick, physically sick. The stress took a toll on her. Jackson wins the election in 1828, but Rachel dies shortly thereafter. And a heartbroken Jackson, who blames the election on his wife's death, travels to D.C. to be inaugurated or sworn in as the 7th President of the United States. when he gets to Washington, D.C., all of his supporters follow along with him. And they're not just any supporters. They're common people in this country, not the refined rich people. And back then, the White House was wide open and anyone could go in it. So as soon as the inauguration was final, that mob rushes into the White House and they are going to have a party. And party they do. They break the White House china. They ruin the White House rugs. They're climbing in and out of windows. Well, it's not long before all of Jackson's supporters have to be herded outside. They've pretty much destroyed the inside of the new White House. That story spreads in the newspapers across America, and it was an embarrassment to the beginning of Jackson's presidency. But make no mistake about it, Andrew Jackson being elected the 7th president of this nation was a turning point in our history. He was the first common person elected to that office. He wasn't rich. He wasn't a landowner. He wasn't from a wealthy family. He was a commoner who had made his way in this new nation and made it all the way to the White House. Now, in our next video, we're going to find out the unfortunate way that Jackson is going to deal with the Indian